Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics. And in this video, as the orange one continues to rip up my schedule, I'd like to discuss how Trump's win could shake things up regarding European unity. I don't just mean between the UK and the EU, although that's going to be a big part of what I talk about, even within the EU itself, because right now there's a lot of people across much of Europe not really appreciating the threat Putin poses to us all. Yes, they don't like him invading Ukraine. We must fight against Putin. But a lot of people don't seem to see a wider problem. And this may need to change, and it may need to change very rapidly. But first, for daily political commentary, please click the subscribe button so you don't miss out. So there are lots of places I could start here. There's actually a lot to this. There's how this impacts moves to try to reverse Brexit. There's how NATO could be impacted, how we're going to need to respond to the threat of a trade war. But let's begin with the EU itself, because there's a lot of people who look at the EU as this thing, oh, this is what the EU wants, and as if the EU is a person. And the Brexiteers look at the EU like that. Even when we were in the EU, they always looked at it as there was the EU and then there was the UK. It's like, you do know we're part of the same thing. No, they didn't. And a lot of people, I think, are still looking at the EU as if it's got this view that it's a person. And it's not. It's a whole mess of different governments that keep changing and have different views and their priorities change. So let's look at the breakdown. Orban, who's a willing Putin puppet, he will welcome the chaos that Trump is promising for Europe. Until such time as Russia threatens Hungary directly, he is likely to frustrate any efforts to counter whatever Trump will do. That will inevitably trigger more talk about how it shouldn't be possible for one or two member states to block important moves, but there's no sign it'll be anything other than talk. For all I know, the EU can't actually function without member states having this power of veto effectively. What I do know is that Orban has this power and he's going to wield it in Putin's interests and egged on very much by Trump. Then we've got Meloni of Italy. Now, you wouldn't necessarily know that she's a big fan of Putin, given Italy's support for Ukraine under her leadership. But the realpolitik calculations for her might change with Trump now. Might she be emboldened to revert to type? Slovakia and the Netherlands also have governments who are fairly likely to embrace Trump rather than see him as a threat. There's also the National Rally Party in France to watch out for in a few years. Austria could be awkward. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, Germany is entering uncertain times, just for the cherry on top. Now, the EU, of course, always manages to come up with a unified position eventually, but with the lack of a naturally unified attitude towards either Trump or Putin, it may take longer for the EU to come to their consensus. In fact, I'm seeing quite a bit of chatter amongst, experts at the moment, EU experts, suggesting some EU governments may try to come to private arrangements with Trump themselves, like bilateral deals just for their country, in an effort to shield themselves from, they know he hates the EU, but, they may try and sidle up to him and go, yeah, but we're different, we're on your side, right? That is going to mean that it takes longer to form consensus and that consensus could be weaker in the immediate future. Basically, the EU is not of one mind when it comes to Trump. He has the potential, intentionally or not, and he would like it to be intentionally, to provoke disunity within the EU itself. On lots of very specific and very controversial policy areas, Trump could really throw a spanner in the works. And like I say, Trump hates the EU. So the idea of sowing discord will appeal to him. It will definitely appeal to Musk. Climate change is considered a real emergency by many people around Europe, but there are powerful interests who are suffering from the costs of it. We've had protests around Europe from farmers who are upset that they are suffering from efforts to move to net zero. Are governments doing enough to shield certain groups from the economic impacts of what is necessary for nothing less than the survival of the species? The potential for major discord in Europe is now much more likely. Will NATO exist in any serious form in the next year or so? We don't know. Europe is already not united on issues such as the war in Ukraine, immigration, the climate emergency, and responding to China's economic output. And yet these are the most important issues for the EU right now. Trump is not likely to take a measured approach to any of these areas. So now we can see how potentially fractured the EU could be here. What about throwing the UK into the mix? Well, on security grounds, cooperation between the UK and the EU definitely becomes way more important, and there's a good chance that both sides see this. Certainly Starmer has talked up the prospect of this. But what about trade? Well, this is where I'm the bearer of bad news, because you'll also say, well, with the threat of this trade war, surely trade cooperation is much more important as well. And yes, I would agree with that. But the standard position of the rejoin community was already, well, we should just join the EU, or at least the single market, preferably by next Tuesday, and everything will be hunky-dory. And that this Trump win makes the urgency of doing so greater. But those advocating these views are well-meaning but not experts. I'm not an expert. The other large platforms you see active on YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, wherever, not experts either. Actual experts. Some of them, do have a presence on social media. They do make an effort, but their platforms are fairly modest, if they're even active at all. Some are. So what about those who are experts? The people who have actually worked on developing EU policy as their jobs. They know how it works. They know how the EU thinks and how it prioritizes things. What do they say? Well, this is the bad news. Those I follow have already been vocal about how unrealistic the mainstream rejoin demands are, and that they would do better to focus on what's realistic. But Trump winning, far from providing a nudge to push the EU and UK close together, could frustrate the process. Seems paradoxical, doesn't it? In fact, I've seen the odd person even suggesting it could make the process way more difficult. So why is this? If it would be in the EU and UK's interest to get closer on trade because of this threat of trade wars, why won't the impetus be there to put close together? Well, let's look at it from the UK and the EU point of view. UK first. So one point I keep making, and not a single person expressing this desire for Labour to break its manifesto promise and join the single market next Tuesday has any answer to, is the Conservatives. I mean, let's say Labour hadn't ruled out anything at the election, so they wouldn't be breaking any promises, and decided we should begin the process to rejoin the EU, or just try to negotiate single market access. Obviously, we'd need a referendum for the first, maybe not the second, meaning we probably couldn't join by next Tuesday. Now, instantly, the Tories will say they will cancel the process when they return to power, and if the process is completed, they'll just leave again. There are other problems with single market next Tuesday advocates that they haven't addressed, but they are irrelevant until the Tory problem has a solution. Because immediately the EU would say, well, don't bother, we're not going to waste our time until the issue is settled in the UK. They already have PTSD from first Brexit. They already mistrust the UK government because we haven't done what we said we'd already do. They don't want another of this. And until the people advocating this cause have an answer to that, and they haven't, then we have nowhere to go. Only Trump makes it worse, because the EU is a competitor to the US, a very, robust competitor, because of the strength of the single market. So Trump will target them. Indeed, it's in America's interest to target the EU. They are a competitor, right? The UK can't actually join the single market in the foreseeable future. So despite what some people insist, the government is going to have to work out a way to look after UK interests outside the EU. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean diverging for the sake of getting close to the UK, to the US. The UK, it doesn't seem to me, can prioritise US trade over EU trade. It makes no sense. It has to find a way to prioritise both. About 2/3 of our total trade is with the EU and the US combined, with nearly twice as much being exported to the EU than the US. So we can't just sit back and do nothing. But does it throw... And we can't choose between them either. Like, other people may make that choice, but we can't, because that's just like... It's deciding that it's better off to cut off your foot than your hand. You don't want to do either. But does it throw another spanner in the works of closer alignment with the EU? I mean, Starmer and Lammy, despite what they have said about Trump in the past, have actually built up a decent relationship so far. Now, if this sounds odd, and certainly it sounds odd to Kemi Badenoch, because she was really trying to push what they'd been saying. Remember, Boris Johnson had said that Trump was off his head at one point, but that did nothing to stop Trump embracing Johnson. Why? Because although he is clearly narcissistic and petulant, what anyone who's ever had close contact with Trump will tell you is he's also transactional. He thinks of himself as this like deal maker. And if he thinks you have something to offer him, that's what he focuses on. This is why Badenoch's jibes yesterday were completely pointless. Trump doesn't care. Doesn't care what people have said about him in the past. He only cares about what he can get out of you. If Trump thinks the UK government has something to offer, he will be very gracious, just as he was when Starmer and Lammy met him a few weeks ago. The question is, what does he think the UK government has to offer? Like, obviously, unlike Johnson, we're not going to be giving him the NHS or telling our public services to buy American. In fact, the Labour have got a manifesto promise to basically tell them to buy British. So I don't know what common ground they are discussing. They must be discussing something. But I do know that trying to keep close to the US under Trump, while still trying to work with deals with the EU, has now extra friction. Trump will not like us working with the EU. Doesn't like the EU. And despite what some may want, we cannot just stick two fingers up at Trump and let him do his worst, because we know what that is and we know what happens at the next election. We've just seen how inflation screwed the Democrats. Yes, there are other factors as well, but polling kept showing that inflation was the #1 public concern for ages. You do not feed the #1 concern for the public and expect to win the next election. The last thing Labour can afford to do is invite Trump to wreck our economy just because we don't like him. Then we need to look at this from the EU's point of view. Right now, they've got loads of concerns. There's dealing with the climate emergency whilst keeping citizens on board and protecting economic interests. Massive problem, takes a lot of time. There is the response to Chinese products on the market. There's the huge problem of Putin's war against the West, where Europe is heavily reliant on the funds and military presence of the United States, and that the American government has hitherto been happy to let Russia break itself slowly on the Ukrainian bulwark rather than ending the threat quickly, which we could have done 2 years ago. Actual EU policy experts have been pointing out that we in Britain need to understand that, yes, okay, we're sort of important, but we are not a priority compared to the huge challenges they are facing. So now the EU have an extra problem, Donald Trump. So it may well be argued that Trump means that closer relationships with the EU are even more important and urgent. Yes, indeed, I've made the same argument myself, but it doesn't follow this means there's this force pushing us closer. David Hennig, for example, who is an EU policy expert, makes the point that actually it's less likely. Closer moves are now less likely because the EU are basically even busier. I've even seen others suggest it's not just a capacity issue, that there just may be less motivation. But on the bright side, Hennig and others have suggested that what Labour could do now is go all out on the security and energy agreement, and that the EU should also see this as a priority. We know that both the UK and EU have had other priorities recently, but both sides need to wake up to the new reality. And I get the impression that the UK government at least have not been discussing this at cabinet level. Starmer and Lammy will have definitely been talking about Trump for some time, but those discussions have not spread to the wider cabinet. How do I know this? Well, Chris Mason of the BBC has been reporting that he talked to a cabinet minister about what they would do in the event of a Trump presidency, and their response was F knows. So that basically suggests this has not been discussed at cabinet level, but it will now have to be. But in trade terms, there's now more friction on both the EU side and the UK side for closer alignment because of Trump. Far from the orange one pushing us close together, there's a risk he slows down our Brexit healing and reversal. I mean, some may think, well, you know, but then if we don't find common ground with Trump and he decides there's no transactional benefit in being nice to Labour in the future, then, you know, okay, does that mean that? First of all, we shouldn't hope for that, because that means inviting economic damage. And what sort of person who wants to rejoin the EU invites economic damage? But also, it could still be harder to work with the EU, even because that process of rebuilding trust is sort of on hold, because we'll be trying to basically play two sides that hate each other, the US and the EU. So that could be a problem as well. Now, I would love for that view to be contested, you know, for there to be an actual debate amongst experts, for some experts to actually be backing the standard mainstream rejoin view. But I'm afraid it's very much like that so-called debate between the Tory ignoramus Andrea Leadsom and Pascal Lamy, who'd actually led the WTO for 8 years, about how world trade works. You know, we never saw disagreement about the impact of Brexit from the actual experts, which is why you never saw debate between experts during Brexit. And I'm not seeing much disagreement about the prospects of closer integration between the EU and the UK in the short term, aside from, as I say, the possibility of security and energy, which could, of course, lead to other things. You know, I invite people, as I've done before, point me out an expert, a genuine expert who thinks otherwise. I'd be very interested. But unless and until someone does so, the fact of the matter is, according to the experts, the mainstream rejoin movement is demanding impossible things. And they're just getting angrier and angrier at Keir Starmer because he's not giving them. But from Keir Starmer's point of view, who also has experts advising him, he's going, you're asking for unicorns, mate. And a Trump presidency is not, according to experts, actually going to give us a quicker path back. Paradoxically, it might make it more important, but it makes it less likely as well, at least in the short term. Like I said, there's no silver lining to Trump winning. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, you can join for memberships. Thanks for watching. And until next time, I'll see you later.